I ended up pulling the plug at 48 miles because it really just felt like I was a little cooked. This year, after I had an Achilles issue and started rebuilding, I decided, all right, I'm going to try a high carbohydrate diet in order to attempt to be able to target some of these higher carbohydrate per hour ranges that we're seeing. I have found historically for 12 hours, I can usually tolerate somewhere around 600 milligrams of caffeine. So I really like a setup where it's about 2/3 gel, 1/3 liquid carbohydrate. So the way I like to set that up is I do tie a fair bit of stuff into my fluid intake. People are going to differ with this. Some people aren't going to want to do that. They're going to want to separate that more so they have more individual control. And I can totally appreciate that. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Welcome, everyone. If you enjoy the show, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast listening platform and YouTube. You can now also check out the full video episode on X. Please also consider sharing your favorite episodes and leaving a review. If you do that and tag me or send me a screenshot, I will enter you in a monthly raffle for a free 30-minute consultation with me. For full episode details, including notes, timestamps, transcripts, and the show Patreon page, and other ways to support the show, please head over to my website at zachbitter.com. There you can find all my coaching services, including some new offerings for 2025. You can also sign up for my Substack newsletter, where I have been publishing my training journal weekly, as well as other topic-based posts. If you have any questions or feedback, please don't hesitate to reach out to me on my website or at hpopodcast@gmail.com. A big thanks to Element Electrolytes, Delta G Ketones, ProBio Nutrition, and Training Peaks for supporting the podcast. I have links and promotions to these brands in the show notes, but you can also get them here. If you want to check out Element Electrolytes, head over to drinklmnt.com/HPO. That'll get you a free sample pack with your first purchase. At deltagketones.com, if you enter promo code BITTER20, you will get 20% off your next purchase. And if you go to probionutrition.com, enter promo code ENDURANCE, and that will get you 20% off your next purchase. If you're interested in getting deeper into your own training data, head over to trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. All right, welcome back, everyone. For the final episode of 2025, I'm going to do a topic-based episode where I dive into the assessment process I like to use after completing a training cycle and a goal race, and just share with you how I take that all apart and pull out things that I felt worked really well that I can more or less trust and put on cruise control heading into the next training cycle, and things that maybe didn't go so well or that I need to adjust, and then I can spend a little more time thinking about optimizing for that to make sure that I'm not making the same mistakes again. So this particular training cycle that spanned the second half of the year, I think is a good one to do this for because it had a pretty good mix of all that stuff. It wasn't something where everything went great and there wasn't a lot of kind of learning opportunities from mistakes or failures, but it also was far from failing left, right, and center to the degree where I felt like, oh, man, I got to go back to the drawing board and rewrite everything I'm doing type of a scenario. It was a pretty good mix of everything. So I'll start this by maybe touching on a little bit on the end race for the year for me, which was the Desert Solstice Track Invitational, where I missed all my goals going into it. So it ended up being a pretty bad result. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think that was, at least this point in time. I'm about a week out, so maybe I'll learn a little bit more about to what degree that this was the case as I get myself back into some structured training and see how my body's feeling. But at the end of the day, I went in there with kind of two main goals. And the top goal was to try to PR in the 100 mile, which would mean breaking 11 hours and 19 minutes for me. The second goal was, if things didn't feel great early and I could course correct soon enough, just try to break 12 hours for a strong 100 mile, end the year with another sub 12 hour 100 mile. I ended up not being able to get either of those. I ended up pulling the plug at 48 miles because it really just felt like I was a little cooked. I think in hindsight, I just drew out the ultra marathon long run phase of training a little bit too long, and it came and bit me at that last race. So in terms of like maybe what one of the first learning things was for me was just the proximity that I'm placing 100 miles with one another and how long I'm looking at extending that phase of training versus resetting and going back to some of the more fundamental training principles before doing that peaking phase that I like to do for 100 miles and things that are going to be a little bit longer in duration and lower in intensity. So that was maybe the first kind of thought afterwards, was that was likely the scenario that I was dealing with. But again, I'll talk about that maybe a little more in the future as I get into some structured training in 2026 and see how my body's responding to things. But at this point in time, I'm pretty confident that is likely the case, because the training as a whole for the 6 months went quite well. It was actually, when I look back at everything from the early phases of training, the short intervals, the long intervals, the standard long runs, the long runs with some pace work in it, the ultra marathon specific long runs and things like that, there was like pretty much definitely the best 6-month training cycle I've had since we moved to Austin 4 years ago. I've had some training cycles that were as good or maybe better than this in the past when I was in Phoenix, but in terms of making a pretty big jump in what I got out of that 6 months compared to anything I've done since moving to Austin, it stood out. So I definitely want to leverage that and carry a lot of that over into the next training cycles, and hopefully compound some training cycles on top of one another where there aren't interruptions other than structured downtime that I plan versus being injured and things like that. Because I think that's been part of the issue for me here in Austin, is I've had some training cycles that were heading in the right direction, and then I've had some unfortunate timing with injuries and things like that that's derailed that sort of thing. So a takeaway is, I think the training, generally speaking, went really well. A lot of positives there. I need to be a little bit more cautious about how long I draw out that long run, ultra long run development phase of training. And I probably need to be a little more strategic about how closely I'm placing 100-mile efforts, if one of those 100-mile efforts is going to be a PR attempt. I think there's maybe an opportunity for me to say do 200 miles in relative close proximity if the goal for both of them is a more conservative target. But if one of them is going to be a PR target, it's just asking to draw out that ultra long run peaking phase a little bit longer than I can probably ask my body to do reasonably. And the risk of having a day like I did at Solstice, it just gets high enough where I probably shouldn't put myself in that position. So that's a big takeaway for me going into the planning phase of 2026 in terms of how I'm going to structure the different races, because there are just going to be certain courses that lend themselves to going after a PR and ones that maybe aren't, just due to logistics and their opportunity to present a fast time and eliminate as many of the hurdles that would maybe slow you down to some degree or another for a fast runnable 100-miler. So those are two really big takeaways for me personally. Another one that was a pretty big standout thing for me during this training cycle was my nutrition. So one of the reasons for that is I've been doing a lower carbohydrate approach to my 100-mile racing for 14 years. This year, after I had an Achilles issue and started rebuilding, I decided, all right, I'm going to try a high carbohydrate diet in order to attempt to be able to target some of these higher carbohydrate per hour ranges that we're seeing some of the top guys in this sport hit on some of the better performances that we're seeing out there nowadays. And going into that, I had a lot of curiosity around how that would work, what would maybe be some hurdles I'd have to try to get over. And I really think over the 6 months, I've gotten to a point where within the context of high carbohydrate and high carbohydrate fueling, I found an approach that I can more or less rinse or repeat and trust versus feel like I have to be worried about or continue to refine. So going into 2026, I really think I can maybe focus a little more energy on some other aspects versus having to try to continue to learn that. And I'll give you a little bit of a breakdown of kind of how I have things structured and why I more or less think that's going to work for me. One is I have 2 races, albeit one was essentially about a 50-miler or something, about 5 to 6 hour duration, and then one that was 12 hours or just a little bit past 100 miles. Both of those races, I was pretty easily able to hit 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour. At no point during either of those did I find that I was struggling from just upper or lower GI issues to the degree where I was like, okay, this approach just isn't sustainable the way I have it right now, and it's going to cause more problems. If anything, I was surprised at how well it worked. In hindsight, when I look back at it, based on my initial thoughts, I think I was able to do a lot less kind of gut training than what a lot of people think maybe you would need to do, or at least what I thought I would maybe have to do in order to tolerate that. And it just didn't happen to be the case. I found that getting right about 100 grams per hour is a pretty easy process for me when I have the structure I currently have in place, which basically is focusing on my longer runs. So like my runs that are usually 2 hours or beyond, I'm practicing my race fueling strategy. And I'm not even practicing it to the full capacity, meaning hitting those higher gram per hour targets in a lot of cases. Most of the time, I'm usually between 2/3 to 3/4 of my gram per hour target from race day, but I'm really consistent of doing that over like essentially dozens of long runs when we get into just the whole span of a training cycle and that ultra long run development phase where I'm really doing just a lot more of that type of work. And I'm finding that if I'm pretty consistent hitting 2/3 to 3/4 of that for those, and then occasionally doing one that's a pretty specific training or race day simulation, getting up closer to the actual targets I'm going to hit on race day, that's enough to make my digestion be able to tolerate that. The only other thing that I've been doing would be potentially some gut training outside of the training fueling itself. So for those who've been listening to this podcast consistently over the last few months, you might remember I did a couple episodes that just highlighted my process of switching to high carbohydrate and what I was doing. And one thing I noticed early on in that transition is you do have to be mindful of just carbohydrate sources where you can go like really whole food based and get a lot of fiber along for the ride. And in the early stages, I found, okay, there's like a line you don't want to go beyond, where if you're doing too much kind of whole food carbohydrate sources or higher fiber carbohydrate sources, you can easily just do too much of that. And then it just becomes a hassle, at least for me digestively and feeling comfortable throughout the day with that. So I pulled back a little bit and replaced some of the whole food carbohydrate sources with more low fiber, more refined options to find that sweet spot for me. But after I had some repetitions with what felt like a pretty good setup with that regard, I got a little curious about just what could be done in terms of just gut expansion in general, so that when you get out there for, say, a long run on a relatively empty stomach, it wouldn't feel as full with more refined sports-specific carbohydrate inputs. So one thing I was doing was I would pick a spot maybe 3 times a week where I was finished with the training for the day. I had a decent stretch of time before my next training session. And oftentimes my next training session was a little lower consequence. It wasn't like intervals or a long run or something I had to do like really early in the morning. And I would have a meal after that last training session that was just a lot higher volume and kind of carbohydrate specific, sugar specific, essentially, fructose specific. And one way I'd do that is I'd make this really big fruit bowl. So it was like this big fruit bowl with like apples, pears, pineapples, grapes, berries, and things like that. And it was just something where I was going to get this huge bolus of sugar essentially, and then also have a lot of volume that came in with it. And I would definitely feel full, like uncomfortably full after eating that. But since I was basically shutting things down for the day at that point and just relaxing, going to bed, and had that timeline between my next quality training session, it wasn't something that I felt was going to be problematic in terms of me being able to be productive during the rest of the day or having digestive issues on the next training session and things like that. And I do think that probably helped. I think maybe that was one of the reasons why I didn't have to overclock fueling in training to a degree where in order for me to tolerate, say, 100 grams per hour on race day, I needed to be doing that consistently or going above that consistently in training to really overstress the gut. So I don't know for sure if that's the case. That's just my thought process or my thinking out loud side of the approach, but it is something that I'm confident enough in for me personally that I'm going to keep doing it because it doesn't seem to be problematic and it seems to be potentially helping. So I'm going to keep that in the rotation going into 2026 as a non-workout gut training protocol that'll probably lean on a little bit more heavily during the ultra long run phase, because that's going to be the phase where I think the gut training is going to be a little bit more important. And it's also going to be a phase where I'm further removed from doing, say, short intervals, long intervals on as a frequent basis, where maybe I wouldn't want to be playing around with as much of that sort of potential digestive risk for sessions like that. Next is just like the protocol I ended up learning through training and racing that I'm really confident in that I'm going to apply for race day. The way I want to do it is I have a protocol now of carbohydrate targets and types, fluid and electrolytes, and then supplements that I think are just something that I have figured out in a way where I can package that and apply it and set it and forget it and free up any other cognitive loading that would take for something else to stay focused on the race specifics and things like that. So the way I have it set up right now is when I get to about an hour before the training session that I'm replicating race day or race day itself, is I'm going to have two caps of black currants, which is a black currant berry, which has some evidence that suggests it's good for blood flow, fat oxidation, and digestion. So since I've had such good luck with digestion with that in the protocol, it's not something I'm looking to change, and that's the protocol I've been using, so I'm going to stick with that. I also have about a 16 to 20 ounce bottle of water where I mix a pack of element electrolytes to do some sodium loading prior to that session at a higher concentrate than I would typically have for that amount of fluid. And then I'll usually mix a packet or a serving of the ProBio Nutrition, which is my multivitamin prebiotic supplement that I like to use on a daily basis. So I'll check all those boxes with that last bottle during that first hour leading into the race itself. Then once I start the race, I really like trying to be very even with my carbohydrate intake over the course of the race. So rather than arriving at 90 to 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour by having these big boluses and then these smaller inputs and going back and forth between those and getting that average, I like to keep it pretty flatlined. So trying to get 90 to 100 grams pretty consistently 1 hour after the next seems to work really well for me, and makes it logistically pretty easy for me too. So I'm pretty inclined to trust that setup that I have, that I found worked really well at Equalizer and worked really well for the 5 to 6 hours I was out there at Solstice. At Solstice, I didn't get to any point during that race where I was like, okay, digestively, I'm having some issues, and this is part of the reason why I'm not getting what I want out of this race. It was rock solid. I wouldn't put that as any sort of a concern. So it did give me an opportunity to stress test that for a longer duration than I normally would in training, even though it wasn't 12 hours like it was at Equalizer. What that is made up of. So I really like a setup where it's about 2/3 gel, 1/3 liquid carbohydrate. So the way I like to set that up is I do tie a fair bit of stuff into my fluid intake. People are going to differ with this. Some people aren't going to want to do that. They're going to want to separate that more so they have more individual control. And I can totally appreciate that. If that's what your experience has been showing you, you should definitely go that route. For me, I tend to be able to put a few different things into one and minimize logistics into one thing. And then it makes it just a little bit easier, both cognitively and logistically. So I fill up basically a 2+ gallon jug and mix all my fluid, all my liquid carbohydrate, all my electrolytes, and most of my caffeine, and some of my exogenous ketones too. So the way I do that is I will mix the fluids to match my electrolyte loss. So when I fill it up, whatever the total is for that, I'm going to mix in element electrolytes to that 614 milligrams per liter that I personally lose. So it's important to note that people are going to range on their electrolyte loss. So my protocol may vary from yours. If you get someone who's higher on the electrolyte loss side of things, you're going to want to have a stiffer concentration in there. If you're someone who's lower than me, although I am skewed a little bit more to the lower side of things, so it's less likely that you're much lower than me, then you're just going to want to put less in. And I like that because then when I get handed that bottle, I get a certain amount of carbohydrate per ounce. I get the right concentration of electrolyte. And then I have like just a steady drip of exogenous ketones from the Delta G Performance that I use for race day. And then I'm just knocking all that out at once. If I drink more, then I get the extra electrolytes because it's already pre-mixed. If I drink a little bit less, I can always add more some of the other stuff if I need to, whether that be exogenous ketones or caffeine or something like that too. Just a quick reminder, Training Peaks is one of the best tools for monitoring your training progress and my go-to tool when coaching individuals. At Training Peaks, you can get deep into the data, assess training load, recovery, and easily monitor progress across all training intensities. It is a perfect example of a program that takes much of the guesswork out of your training and coaching experience. I really love assessing intervals on Training Peaks. One of the first things I'll do when I get back from a run is I'll hop onto Training Peaks, unpack all that data, and just see how each of those individual intervals went and really dive into where I could maybe improve in the future. So if you're interested in getting deeper into your own training data, head over to trainingpeaks.com/HPO podcast. The other aspect of what I like to do for these races is I like to have a very low but continuous drip of caffeine over the course of the race versus boluses and then break periods. Again, that's something else that's going to take a little individual playing around with. That's not going to be everyone's preference or everyone's positive experience. But for me, I find when I do bigger boluses, I end up feeling almost too fidgety or too aggressive with my pacing and my perceived effort. And then you get met with maybe a bit of a dip and you're riding a little bit more of a roller coaster. When I do smaller amounts spread out evenly, I find like my focus stays pretty dialed in and I get that aspect out of the caffeine, but not the jittery side of things or the I feel great now and I feel terrible later type of experience that some people are going to get from higher amounts of caffeine. So for me, I have found historically for 12 hours, I can usually tolerate somewhere around 600 milligrams of caffeine. So that's usually what I'll plan to get in over the course of the days. And I'll have most of that mixed in with that fluid I take in. And then I'll have some other options to take in if I want a little bit of extra for one reason or another, whether it be I'm just taking in less fluid because the day is cooler or everything's working really smooth and I'm near the end of the race and I feel like I can tolerate a little more caffeine and I do want to hit that a little bit harder. I have that option, but most of it is going to be tied to that jug of water, electrolytes, carbohydrates, and ketones that I have already set up. So in terms of how much exogenous ketones I'm doing, I'm usually doing one bottle of the Delta G ketones prior to the race because it's a low intensity race. If it were a higher intensity race, like a marathon or shorter, I probably wouldn't do that. I'm not necessarily convinced that's going to be a value add in that context, and it could potentially be a detriment. But for these lower intensity ones, I'm not too concerned about that. If anything, I'm more concerned about getting out a little too fast. So I don't mind doing a full serving of that to start that race off. And then from there, I'm doing really small amounts with 2 or 3 bottles mixed into that fluid jug that I have so that I'm just slow trickling that in over the course of the race itself. And then the only other thing I'm really doing consistently is I do re-up on the currents caps. So I'll have another currents cap every 3 hours that I'm out there. So I do those 2 to start. And then at 3, 6, 9, and so on, depending on how long that race is going to be, is the frequency at which I'm going to re-add that supplement to the mixture. And that's basically it. That's the protocol I find that I really like and is going to be what I carry into 2026. So that covers that for the most part. The other thing that I think is interesting too, and it's getting more interesting as products get developed and things like that, is just shoes. So I wore a ton of different shoes over training, and I played around with a bunch of different options and things like that. And it has been a fun experience that's going to continue into 2026 for the most part. And I'll continue to refine that as I see products come out and as I find things that are working well for me. But I ended up using the Puma Fast R3 for both the Equalizer and Desert Solstice. Now, that shoe, from an efficiency standpoint, you're going to have a hard time finding something that beats that. It scores about as good or better than pretty much anything you're going to find on the market. But usually when you have these very efficient shoes, the compromise oftentimes there is stability. So the Fast R3 is also one of the least stable super shoes that I've worn. And I think there's a conversation to be had, at least at the individual level, of how much of that compromise you can make. And a course might make a big difference there. So for example, say I'm running a fast track 400 meter loop ultra. That's going to be different than, say, a course like Tunnel Hill, where you're running 100 miles on very fast terrain in both those scenarios. But one, you're turning basically half the time. And the other one, you're running straight basically the entire time. Tunnel Hill is basically straight out and backs, where you do a 180-degree turn just a few times over the course of 100 miles. But for the most part, you're moving in a straight line. So I think that's going to make a difference. Where I think with the Equalizer, I didn't find that the Fast R3 felt all that problematic. I did feel like it was maybe a little bit more impactful early on. I didn't notice it being quite as lively maybe near the end of the race. I didn't notice it to be a huge problem on race day from a stability standpoint either. I did notice after the race I had some aches and sorenesses in areas that would suggest like lower leg instability. That it was just an interesting point in terms of like maybe what I could get away with that shoe. I ended up going with it for Desert Solstice. In hindsight, I think I might have wore a different option. I think I would have leaned a little bit more compromise a little bit of efficiency for a little more stability on a course like that in the future. So for the track ultra, I think I'm going to likely explore some other options for that. Part of the reason is the stability. The other part is I noticed after solstice that my quadriceps were quite a bit more sore than they normally would be after a race like that. And I've done enough track races now where I've got a pretty good understanding of what I should expect with good training. And I didn't even go a full 100 miles. I went about half as far as I normally would on one of those races. And my quads were equally or more sore afterwards in those following days than they had been after some of the 100-mile efforts I've had on a track. So I think just maybe the way that those shoes position you, I'm like eccentrically loading my quadriceps a little bit more than I would in a different shoe. And that's just creating a little more strain on that specific area. So whether that's something where it's, hey, get in that shoe more often and just let your body evolve or adapt to that, or if it's something where I just need to be like, all right, there's a better option for me on that specific environment. Those are all things that I'm really interested and curious about and will continue to explore going into 2026. The other thing I'll just highlight too that I really learned from this training cycle is I think there's a lot of value for me with a more structured cycling component. So I started out this training cycle with cycling being the primary training input because I was rehabbing an Achilles tendon issue. I could only tolerate so much running. But from an energy standpoint, a freshness standpoint, physical standpoint outside of that Achilles tendon, I was ready to put in some work. So I just matched what I would have done with biking until I could ramp up running to a degree where I could start titrating back on the cycling and then move that into a supportive role. But I think structured cycling, even as a supportive role, is something that I want to keep in training because I think there's value adds there for me from just a durability standpoint, just a little bit of a different mechanical stressor in terms of how your legs behave on a bike versus on running is something that I find that my body just feels a little stronger when I have that component in there. And one thing I did do is when I got to the ultra long run development phase of my training, I scaled the cycling completely out. And one of the reasons why I did that is my body was responding really well to the running and the loading to the degree where I hit some of my higher volume running weeks in 4 or 5 years. And I just rolled with it because at the end of the day, I want to be as durable as possible for 100 miles in a real mechanically uniform setting for the most part. And, that working on the specific things, the more you can get away with, the better you're probably going to be able to tolerate that. I think that was okay, especially if I look at it through the lens of ideally I wouldn't have drawn that phase out as long. So going forward, if I do a shorter long run, ultra long run development phase, I might play around with eliminating the bike altogether, but I'm keeping the door open to at least keeping that component in there through that phase as well versus just completely taking on, even if it's just like 1 day per week or something like that. I do think there's probably some consideration to doing that and helping with having that input not get entirely eliminated for that long of a period of time. But generally speaking, in the overall stand things, I think that bike input is just a really good one for me and one I'm going to continue to leverage and give myself the ability to reduce some of the impact during different phases of the year, but to still maintain some of that aerobic input, maybe even keep doing some workouts on it, because early on in this training block, when I was doing higher intensity stuff like VO2 max target stuff or long interval threshold stuff, I did a lot of the early stages of that on the bike before I got to the point where my Achilles was ready to tolerate that from a running standpoint. So that is something I think I'm going to leverage a fair bit in this next phase of training, especially as I add back some more of that kind of short interval, higher on the aerobic intensity spectrum type intensity training. So that's what I got. I think I covered everything I wanted to with the pros, the cons, everything in between. I'm really excited about 2026 because I had a really good training cycle, and I found historically when I can compound training cycles injury-free with just planned short off seasons, I tend to get stronger in racing. I think looking at the calendar going into 2026, I'm excited to maybe do some shorter ultras too, versus just kind of focusing on the 100-mile distance, using those as more BC races or kind of ultra specific long run type stimuluses is going to be a fun add-in, and then ultimately take a crack at a couple more 100-milers next year. Right now it's looking like Pettit Center in June is probably going to be a big one where I maybe take a swing at a PR there. That's about as fast of a spot as I've found from both a logistic and a climate control standpoint. And then heading into the end of next year, I'd love to get back to Tunnel Hill, just take another swing at that course because I think I've left quite a bit of time on that course in the past. But if Tunnel Hill doesn't work out, Desert Solstice is always there. There's some opportunities in the fall for fast runnable hundreds that always are something that I have to pick between. So that's the general scaffolding of maybe how I'm looking at things now, where I'll probably have some 50Ks, 50 miles, maybe 100K interspersed between those events. But that's kind of the way I'm looking at it. So if you have any questions about any of this, feel free to shoot me a note. If it's specific about the stuff I talked about, if you're curious, like, hey, why did you say this? I would like to know more. Or if it's specific to your own training and racing prep with going through this process, happy to help you out. If you are looking for more support on the coaching front, I do offer a range of different options between pre-made plans, one-on-one support at varying tiers, as well as group packages where we meet once a week as a group and hang out, talk about training, make adjustments to training, cover topics, questions, all that sort of stuff. So feel free to head over to my website for any of that stuff at zachbitter.com. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.